provided under Rule 4311. We will now move on to question period, which will be extended by 7.5 minutes. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. The RCMP has said that human trafficking is on the rise in Nova Scotia, and I know that the Premier acknowledged this last session. Traffickers target all genders, but the majority of these victims are young women. Many of the girls are taken out of the province, and once they're gone, it's nearly impossible to get them back home. Those who stay in the province are often brainwashed and made to believe that there is no escape for them. So my question for the Premier is, what data is actually being collected and made public regarding human trafficking in this province?
The Honourable Premier.
Minister of Justice and the Attorney General to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. This is a very serious issue in the province of Nova Scotia, quite frankly, across the country. But we know the data that we are receiving through Stats Canada indicates that the circumstances are compounded here in Nova Scotia. We're working very close with our law enforcement community. We're working very close, actually, with our federal government, and I'm looking forward to an announcement in the very near future that will help address this emerging and very exigent concern.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer, and absolutely, it's being compounded. It's amazing what's happening in rural Nova Scotia. We know that RCMP officers are now trained to spot trafficking. We know that even flight attendants are being trained to spot trafficking, and we are arming people with these tools to stop trafficking, but once it has already happened, unfortunately, we are falling short when it comes to preventing it from happening at all together here in Nova Scotia. I guess my question would be, though, what are we doing right now to be proactive in warning our young people within the schools about the dangers of human trafficking, and more importantly, putting an end to this?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are dedicated resources in the province that are not only responding to the enforcement elements. We saw yesterday Halifax Regional Police in their integrated policing model with the RCMP advanced a matter before the court with the arrest, detention, and charge of 4 individuals. A second element to both the RCMP and Halifax Regional Police specific to this subject is that public education and awareness. For the very reasons my colleague has identified, Mr. Speaker, this is not restricted to any one area. As a matter of fact, our young women, our youth in rural Nova Scotia are more vulnerable, and the efforts that are undertaken by our law enforcement community in consultation with stakeholders across the criminal justice system is to do just that, bring greater awareness and education to the issue.
Great job. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On International Women's Day, I'd like to direct a couple of questions about women's health to the Premier. 4 years ago, the program of in-person prenatal courses had its funding discontinued by the province, and this was a great concern for people, because this was a place where soon-to-be parents could meet other soon-to-be parents and ask questions of an instructor, and that program was replaced with an online program. But in January, that online program was discontinued, and the result is that today, in a province where we have over 8,000 babies born every year, the total amount of prenatal session courses, preparation courses that are being funded by the government is 0. And so, Mr. Speaker, on what grounds could the government cut such a crucial program for maternal health?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I will look into why that program would have been changed. Mr. Speaker, I don't have the details associated with it, but I do want to agree with the honourable member, Mr. Speaker. Many of these prenatal classes during, Mr. Speaker, the 9 months that our mothers and daughters are carrying our children, Mr. Speaker, is an important part, but also the important relationships that happen after the child has been born, and the relationship between mothers who share their experiences back and forth. I know for many of them these are lifelong friendships and people they rely on when they have concerns and questions. So I take the question from the honourable member and I will see what I can do to find out to get him an answer.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Premier's answer. Now, last month in Antigonish, midwifery services were suspended. And they had been suspended last year on the South Shore because of understaffing. And Antigonish and the South Shore are the only places in Nova Scotia outside the HRM where publicly funded midwifery services have been offered. So it's not hard to understand why advocates of midwifery, and there are a great many advocates of midwifery, have been comprehensively disappointed in the government's failure to advance on this important front. Mr. Speaker, when a government has lost ground on midwifery and has cancelled prenatal programming, how can they be taken seriously when they talk about regarding the importance of mental health? Of women's health?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable for the question. The issue of midwifery that he talks about, Mr. Speaker, is an important service, Mr. Speaker, that should be offered in communities across the province. We have expanded in the 2 communities that he referred to. Mr. Speaker, it is my belief, though, that that service should be an option for expecting mothers and families, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to make sure, as we are continuing to recruit now for new clinicians, to make sure that we can roll that service out in other parts of the province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition, the New Democratic Party, on his final supplementary.
When the government's 3-year sexual violence strategy expired, funding for trauma-informed therapeutic counselling in places like Yarmouth or Truro or Antigonish came to an end. This was funding that allowed hundreds of women to receive this counselling who would not otherwise have received it. The result is that today, in those communities where that counselling is continuing, it's being funded by the local fundraising efforts of the women's centres. Mr. Speaker, recovery from sexual assault trauma is not something that corresponds to the tidy timelines of a pilot project. It's often a long road, and on that road, the long-term continuity of the therapeutic relationship is something that's very important. What rationale can the Premier provide for cutting funding for counselling for survivors of sexual assault?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, he was referring to a program that was in place that was part of the 2013 election campaign, where we put 3 years of funding available, Mr. Speaker. When that funding was coming to an end, he would know those services are being provided in other departments, some through the Department of Health. We know there's still more work to do. I can tell you the Deputy Premier, the Minister, or the member from Colchester North is continuing to make sure that we ensure that we provide the same service in the Truro area. Mr. Speaker, we know that has to be there. We're continuing to provide that training. But let me tell you that we are continuing to provide support for women and children, Mr. Speaker, who are suffering from sexual violence. It's unacceptable in any of our homes, Mr. Speaker. It's unacceptable in any of our communities. And we as a government are the first government, Mr. Speaker, to have dedicated funding, and we will continue to make sure across department disciplines, Mr. Speaker, that we all have a role to make sure that we deal with this issue.
The Honourable Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. Yesterday, the Minister suggested that the Chief Judge Selection Committee was formed for the purposes of transparency. And the letter I tabled yesterday from February 14th, from the Minister to the Chief Justice, the Minister specifically states that the committee is being struck for the purpose of ensuring independence of the judiciary. I'll read from that letter. The Minister says in his letter, "This process honors the independence of the judiciary in the selection of its chief. I would very much appreciate receiving the short list of recommended candidates by June 2018, if possible." My question for the Minister is, will the Minister confirm that the Chief Judge Selection Committee was actually struck for the purposes of honoring the independence of the judiciary in the selection of its chief?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The correspondence is self-explanatory, but as I said yesterday, Mr. Speaker, within the legislation and processes, the Minister of Justice is not required to strike the committee or ask the chair of the committee to start their work. The Minister of Justice has the authority to reappoint. What I said yesterday, Mr. Speaker, was in the spirit of transparency, I chose to ask the committee to be struck for purposes of advancing a process, Mr. Speaker. That was the intent. The outcome, Mr. Speaker, of a process that we followed resulted in the appointment of a competent and proven Chief Judge of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Perhaps the committee's work didn't matter to the minister, but I'm sure it mattered to the committee. They probably thought they were actually doing something on behalf of the minister. In his letter of February 14th, the minister lists 5 people who will form the committee. And among the 4 members that I listed yesterday, the committee was to include, according to the minister's February 14th letter, the committee was to include the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court where they are not seeking reappointment. On February 21st, the Chief Justice wrote to the minister and requested the process and criteria for the appointment. The terms of reference that the minister provided to the Chief Justice, dated March 9th, so almost a month later, has only 4 people listed on the committee. The Chief Judge has been omitted by that stage, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to ask the minister, the Chief Judge, where not seeking reappointment, was included in February 14th, but not on the March 9th instructions. I'd like to ask the minister, why was the Chief Judge omitted on March 9th?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to correct my colleague again. Quite the contrary to his initial comment. I do value the work of the committee, Mr. Speaker. I do value the work of the committee, Mr. Speaker. It's an important element in the selection process for a Chief Judge. But, Mr. Speaker, my colleague would know it is one element of the process. There are a number of factors that have to be considered, Mr. Speaker. The fact that the incumbent was not included, Mr. Speaker, when we know clearly that the incumbent was an applicant to the process, Mr. Speaker, allows me to look at the collective circumstances in the selection of our Chief Judge, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Judge was not part of the committee, Mr. Speaker, because the legislation doesn't allow it if the Chief Judge has expressed an interest in the position.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
I'm so glad the minister closed with that comment, because the letter from the Chief Justice on February 14th includes that the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court will be on the selection committee where they're not seeking reappointment. But as we've demonstrated, the terms of reference on March 9th omit the Chief Judge. So between February 14th and the transmission of the terms of reference on March 9th, how did the minister come to know that Judge Williams was seeking reappointment?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, it's quite clear that the Chief Judge at the time had expressed an interest and desire to retain and continue in that position, Mr. Speaker. What my colleague has said, and I know, Mr. Speaker, average Nova Scotians would understand when legislation says the sitting judge who expresses an interest cannot be part of the process. I know Nova Scotians understand that, Mr. Speaker. I cannot understand why the Leader of the Opposition does not.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for International Women's Day, and this particular question today is for the Premier. Women's centres in Nova Scotia do essential work in providing direct services for women and girls and advocating for social change. The 9 women's centres across the province are struggling to fill the gaps left when government services are centralized or cut completely. They need funding that covers the real cost of operating. And currently, the Strait Area Women's Place receives only a fraction of the funding provided to the 8 other centres. So, Mr. Speaker, would the Premier please commit today to increasing funding to the Strait Area Women's Centre in Port Hawkesbury in the upcoming budget?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, and I too want to add my voice of thanks to the women's centres across our province who are providing a valuable service to our communities, Mr. Speaker. They're partnering with many organizations across the province as well as a number of departments. They do work for Department of Health, Department of Community Services, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister of Finance announced that she will be tabling her budget on March 26th, and at that point we'll be able to communicate what's in it.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while I appreciate the Premier's gratitude to women's centres, I would really like to see their funding advanced, especially for the Port Hawkesbury Centre, who is in dire need. Mr. Speaker, women's centres are providing individual support and programming to address poverty, domestic abuse, mental health issues, and sexualized violence against women and girls. They're serving more and more women with increasingly complex problems, and the staff of these centres have demonstrated skills and expertise, and they're looking to the government to be their partner. However, in spite of multiple requests, they've not been able to meet with the minister responsible for the status of women once in the past 5 years. So my question, Mr. Speaker, for the Premier, does he think it's appropriate that the minister responsible for the status of women has not met with the province's women's centres, and would he be willing to meet with these women's centre representatives himself?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I've met in my own constituency office, the Women's Centre in my area, Mr. Speaker. I've met with women's centres across the province at various times. Look forward to continuing to partner with them, continue to work with them. I know the Minister responsible for the status of women will continue to work with our partners. I think it's important also to recognize, Mr. Speaker, we continue to provide funding to these organizations, continue to provide the services and supports that are needed in our communities. And I want to continue to thank them for the work that they've been doing with us. For some of the innovative ways that they've been supporting women in communities across this province. Not only, Mr. Speaker, when they find themselves in a vulnerable position, Mr. Speaker, providing them with opportunities of self-employment, opportunities to take in an idea and creating it, they're providing them with a myriad of supports, and we thank them for that.
The Honourable Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Justice. The letter sent from the Chief Justice to the Minister on June 13th states very clearly that there are 2 candidates for the appointment. It also states very clearly that only 1 candidate is recommended. The terms of reference state that the committee should submit to the Minister of Justice a short list of recommended candidates with a précis of information about each. The letter from the Chief Justice references 2 candidates, but they only put 1 name forward. Did the minister not understand that it was implicit that the other candidate was not a recommended candidate?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad my colleague has referenced the term of reference. It's unfortunate that he's being selective in what he's pulling from the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker. And allow me, Mr. Speaker, if I may read from the terms of reference, and I can table that, Mr. Speaker. What my colleague has said is quite right. The committee should submit to the Minister of Justice a short list of recommended candidates with a précis of information about each. Mr. Speaker, if I may.
Please. The Honourable Minister of Justice has the floor.
I have the utmost respect for the position of the Leader of the Opposition, and I will quietly listen to his questions, Mr. Speaker. The terms of reference goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, and I believe, Mr. Speaker, I have to read these in sequence, so I'm asking permission to reread what I just read. The committee should submit to the Minister of Justice a short list of recommended candidates with a precis of information about each. The terms of reference goes on to say, the short list will normally contain not fewer than 3 nor more than 6 candidates, and the candidates will be ranked in order of the committee's preference. We know, Mr. Speaker, there was at least 2 applicants expressing an interest. One of them was the incumbent. It's reasonable, common sense, sound judgment that the incumbent would be considered, Mr. Speaker. There was no name excluded, and there was no name asked to be included.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that the minister has had the opportunity to review the terms of reference, I'm glad that he very clearly stated what they require, and that is that the committee would submit a precis of information on all those on the short list of recommended candidates. Recommended candidates. The committee only submitted one precis of information, making it very clear that the short list of recommended candidates contained only one name. To suggest that there were 2 names involved and 2 recommended names is just patently false. It's not consistent with the letter. Does the minister stand by his statement that there were 2 names on the short list?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to draw conclusions on speculation or interpretations, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to speak specifically to the terms of reference. And this is where I, as the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice, have a responsibility to ensure that the committee is following the process as well, Mr. Speaker. And I'll reread what I said. The short list will normally contain not fewer than 3 nor more than 6. We had 2 applicants to the process, Mr. Speaker. One of them being the incumbent, the sitting chief judge of the provincial court at the time. Why would we not consider the incumbent a proven, competent leader as the chief judge of the provincial court of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I think this is getting a little confusing for members, but let me bring it back down to reality. Mr. Speaker, the minister said yesterday that there were 2 names advanced by the committee, but in fact, they advanced 1 name originally. 1 name, because they did the work the minister asked that they do, which was to find and recommend a candidate. They did that for the minister, but then the minister chose to go back to them and say, no, this is not what I want. There's a problem with that, Mr. Speaker. How is that not interference? When a committee was set up to provide a name, they provide a name, and the minister goes back and says no. So, Mr. Speaker, does the minister acknowledge that he was presented a complete list of names? It was 1 name, and it was in the original letter sent by the committee.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, it's incumbent upon me to ensure that the committee is doing its work, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to read from the terms of reference again, Mr. Speaker, so the House Leader of the Official Opposition understands as well. The short list will normally contain not fewer than 3 nor more than 6 candidates, and the candidates will be ranked in the order of committee's preference. Advancing 1 name in singular, Mr. Speaker, when we know there is 2 applicants who have expressed an interest, and the second one being the incumbent, a proven competent leader of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia, it's reasonable, with an application of common sense and sound judgment, Mr. Speaker, that we consider the incumbent.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Maybe I'm not smart enough to understand the terms of reference, but the Chief Judge is. Surely he is, Mr. Speaker, and he resigned from the committee over this. So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the minister said at no time did he instruct the committee to add names. But yet we know the original letter back to him from the committee recommended a name, and he did go back and instruct them, as the documents were tabled yesterday, and they're very obvious, that he did go back and instruct the committee to give him more names. So, Mr. Speaker, why does the minister deny that that very act was not interference?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I, for the record, want to correct the House Leader for the official opposition, because I did not, Mr. Speaker, and he clearly is not reading the document. What I asked for was a précis, a resume of the second candidate. I wasn't asking to add a name. There was 2 names, Mr. Speaker, 2 applicants that expressed an interest to this job, one of them being the incumbent, Mr. Speaker. That incumbent has proven herself to be a competent chief judge, a proven leader of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, it is reasonable.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
It is reasonable, and the legislation allows me, it is advice and recommendations from the committee, but there's an onus on me, Mr. Speaker, to use all of the information available to make an informed decision. We did that, and as a result, the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia, a proven competent leader, was reappointed.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the issue here is not the competence of anyone, except maybe some of the members in this House, but it's the fact that
Please. I'd ask the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition to retract that statement. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I retract that statement. The issue is that a committee was struck to make a recommendation. We have a sad history in this province of justice ministers overruling the recommendations of committees. People may know the Boundaries Commission issue that happened in this province not too long ago. A committee was struck. A committee did put a name forward, and this minister picked somebody else. So the role of the Associate Chief Judge of the Provincial Court has been vacant since last summer. Presumably, to fill that role, a selection committee must be struck. But however, given the resignation of Chief Justice MacDonald, would it be fair to suggest that the minister has been unable to attract judges to form a committee on account of the minister's interference in the justice system on the last committee?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, my colleague is drawing conclusions. There are processes, Mr. Speaker, that we must follow. I have not asked the acting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia to strike a committee. We are in the process of doing a review, Mr. Speaker, a jurisdictional scan of what happens across the country specific to this particular committee and its role. We continue with that work, Mr. Speaker. I'm quite confident in the leadership of the Chief Justice of the Provincial Court, where she can continue to assume the duties in her primary role, and in the absence of her, appoint a competent senior member of the Provincial Court that could fill in as the acting Chief Judge, Mr. Speaker. These are standard processes. We want to make sure, Mr. Speaker, in a review of this committee's work, that the committee is established and the committee is reflective of those who should be on the committee, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'll redirect to the Premier. Here's what we know. The Minister of Justice convened a committee to appoint a Chief Judge of the Provincial Court. The Minister gave the committee a mandate wherein the Minister acknowledged that the Governor and Council would act on the recommendation of the committee. It's right in the mandate. 2 individuals applied. The committee recommended 1. The name put forward was not the name the minister wanted, and as a result, he directed the Chief Justice to provide the name and details of the other candidate, presumably so he could go with him. That's what he did. The minister ignored the name put forward by the committee and appointed his selection. Then, Chief Justice MacDonald resigned based on the minister's actions, stating that he believed the minister's actions undermined the role of the judiciary. Premier, based on everything you've heard yesterday and today, would you agree that the Chief Justice and the highest judge in the province resigned from the committee as a result of your minister's actions?
We'd just like to remind the Honourable Leader to keep his comments and questions directed to the chair. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the leader of the Conservative Party tabled a letter from Chief Justice MacDonald to the Attorney General dated on June 13th, Mr. Speaker. It says there are two candidates for the Chief of the Provincial and Family Court. He names both candidates, Mr. Speaker. In the bottom of that, Mr. Speaker, he said the committees recommend a preferred candidate. Mr. Speaker, go back to what the Minister of Justice has said, Mr. Speaker. What then when that committee was struck, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear. It's very clear, Mr. Speaker, that they lay out a short list will normally contain no fewer than 3, Mr. Speaker, no more than 6. What the Minister of Justice then responded back and said he was looking for the précis, which is part of the work that the committee should do, Mr. Speaker. He raised the Boundaries Commission, Mr. Speaker, and the work that would happen by the Boundaries Commission. What happened there, Mr. Speaker, is the Attorney General of the day interfered with the work of the committee and wouldn't let them do their job, Mr. Speaker, because they weren't following the process, Mr. Speaker. What this Attorney General did, Mr. Speaker, was said, can you please follow the process and forward us the documents?
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In case my colleagues have forgotten, it's International Women's Day, and so I am going to ask a question in honor of that. My question is for the minister responsible for the status of women. Imagine for a moment someone somewhere in Nova Scotia getting out of bed this morning, getting ready for work, maybe school, and realizing they've started their period. And what if they've just spent their last $20 on food and they won't get paid again until next week? Mr. Speaker, in the province with the lowest median income and the highest food insecurity, this situation is not imaginary. 1/3 of Canadian women under the age of 25 say they've struggled to afford their menstrual products. These products are not a luxury. And I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, is the minister taking specific actions to address period poverty?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question in bringing it back to International Women's Day. Mr. Speaker, the Minister responsible for the status of women continues, she's also the Minister of Community Services, Speaker, continues to work to improve the lives of women and children in our province. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Honourable Member, she talks about the median income, the very report that the New Democrats are pulling that stat out of also talks about the fact that fewer single-parent families are living in poverty in the province. That number is going down. Mr. Speaker, we also know that with seniors, many of whom are widowed, Mr. Speaker, we've seen that number continue to decline. She would also know we as a government have increased the largest single increase in income assistance in the provincial history, Mr. Speaker. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, when we found ourselves to get ourselves to a fiscal balance in reality, the single biggest, largest tax cut that this province has ever had, Mr. Speaker, was in the basic personal exemption, where it was geared towards low-income speakers, Mr. Speaker. But I want to assure the Honourable Member that the Minister of Community Services and the Status of Women has a very strong voice at our cabinet table, Mr. Speaker, continues to make sure that women and girls issues are an important part of our governance agenda, and it will always be. And it's why we look forward to seeing the budget tabled on the 26th.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, starting this past September, menstruating students at Mount St. Vincent University no longer need to pay for pads and tampons on campus. They are made available for free in all the main buildings of the school. The Mounts Student Union made this their major ask for the university's 2018 budget, because they can't afford to pay for their products. I think that they were on to something. Mr. Speaker, will the minister agree to include funding in the budget to provide free pads and tampons in universities, schools, government offices, libraries, and all public buildings so that people who menstruate have access to these essential items?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, the budget will be tabled on the 26th. I'm sure she'll be interested in what's in that budget. I do want to go back to this very important issue, though, Mr. Speaker, living in poverty. It's why we continue to make investments that impact families across the province. That pre-primary program, Mr. Speaker, is an important step to ensuring that we provide every 4-year-old, regardless of the socioeconomic circumstances, are born into the same opportunity and start. Mr. Speaker, oftentimes, Mr. Speaker, single parents parents, allows them to get back into the workforce, Mr. Speaker, earlier. That's a positive thing, Mr. Speaker. I want to continue to make sure she would know we've created school breakfast programs across the province. I think we're almost at around 95% today, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to get to 100%. These are all positive things that we're working for low-income families across this province, and we'll continue to do that. And I want to reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that the minister has a strong voice at our cabinet table, and I continue to look forward to listening and working with her to ensure those Nova Scotians that need our support will get it.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A report recently came out from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, ranking the best and the worst places in Canada for women. The only Nova Scotia location, Halifax, ranked 22 out of 26. In terms of leadership, Halifax actually ranked dead last. Women only hold 12% of the seats on HRM Council, well below the 34% national average for cities. My question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, does he feel women are sufficiently encouraged to run for municipal office in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. She raises a very important issue, Mr. Speaker. In 2013, when we were given the privilege, Mr. Speaker, to govern this great province, gender equality on the provincial and family court bench, Mr. Speaker, was starkly different, Mr. Speaker. Today, Mr. Speaker, we have gender parity on provincial and family court bench. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that we as a government have appointed more women to the Executive Council than any other government in the history of our province, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I want to continue to make sure if she looks at the senior levels of inside of our government, Mr. Speaker, she will see gender parity when it comes to deputy ministers in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I will add to this, and Mr. Speaker, she's right. We need more women running for not only municipally but provincial seats across this province, Mr. Speaker. It's why we invest in a program, Mr. Speaker, around a college for candidates. I know many members of this House attended that college, Mr. Speaker. We continue to make sure. It's why I continue to make sure that my own two children, my daughter and my son, take an active role in public policy. So hopefully, Mr. Speaker, one or both of them may decide that they want to take a run in seats, and it's all incumbent on all of us. Today, we were greeted with 6 amazing young women, Mr. Speaker, that I'm very certain someday we'll see one of them in this House.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot of work to do. 50% of our population are female. And in preparing for this question, it takes me back to when I was 16. It was the first time I was motivated to run for public office, when there were no females elected in a local municipal election. To this day, even in Cumberland County, there's only 17% of women represented. Here in HRM, only 12% are female. And across the province, only 27% of all councillors are female. My question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, will the minister make a commitment to setting a goal that in the next municipal election, 50% of the councillors that are elected across this province are female?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think she should strive for higher than that, Mr. Speaker. I don't think we should set a cap on it, Mr. Speaker. We should continue to make sure that everyone who wants to aspire for elected office should be given the support and inspiration to do so, Mr. Speaker. And it's my hope that we will see a selection of candidates across this province, Mr. Speaker, that reflect the reality of this great province, Mr. Speaker, on gender, on diversity, making sure that underrepresented populations are being here. Mr. Speaker, I too share her hope that we will see 50% of women someday in this House and on municipal councils across the province.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Our school system teaches about the dangers of the world. We teach fire safety, the dangers of alcohol. Someday we may even properly teach about the dangers associated with cannabis. But we don't teach about the dangers of human trafficking. These very real dangers need to be made clear from a young age so fewer girls get brainwashed and taken advantage of. My question for the Minister of Education is human trafficking awareness included in the school curriculum, and if so, at what grade level?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That's a very important question. This is a matter of significant importance for all of us in this province. I can provide the member with the details on related curriculum. I don't know how enhanced the issues on human trafficking are. off the top of my head, but we can find that out. There is a process established for curriculum development. It is being led by teachers who come into the department, help us develop the curriculum that's needed to give the best education possible, the most relevant education possible for our students. And if there's any good advice that the members have, I'm sure we can make sure that that group takes a look. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Human trafficking isn't a new problem in Nova Scotia. Girls were picked up and trafficked from Micmac Mall in Dartmouth in the 1970s. A CBC News release of just yesterday outlines a human trafficking bust in Dartmouth, and Nova Scotia RCMP recently said they were seeing a rise in suspected human trafficking cases in the province, and I'll table that document. We continue to react rather than prevent. My question to the minister is, will he commit to adding human trafficking, not just related, but human trafficking to the school curriculum, keeping in mind girls as young as age as 14 are being lured on social media?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very, very troubling statistics and information, of course, that we all take very seriously and have great concerns over. We need to make sure that curriculum is age appropriate and is effective. We do have a process in place to review curriculum on an ongoing basis. That is not driven necessarily by the minister's office, but in fact those on the front lines, and we will make sure that our curriculum team has a look at this topic, and if there's any specifics that we do have in our curriculum that the member would be interested of on this topic, I'll make sure that she's aware of them.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the spirit of International Women's Day, I'd like to commend women who continue to make strides in fields in which they have been a minority in leadership for far too long. There is work which still needs to be done in traditionally male-dominated areas like fisheries, aquaculture, and agriculture. And Mr. Speaker, I speak in no way disparagingly or to lessen the role of the fine men who work in these sectors. These sectors are some of the leading revenue generators in our province, contributing hundreds of millions annually to our economy, yet women remain vastly underrepresented. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the minister if he is aware of how many women are currently working or even better yet, directly own a fisheries, aquaculture, or agriculture business.
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries, Agriculture and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much. And I was just recently talking to a young lady who was in the audience, and she does have a license.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Oh my goodness. I thank the minister for the curt answer, and I congratulate that one woman who has her fisheries license. Mr. Speaker, the government of PEI recently took action to address the barriers preventing more women from becoming leaders in these sectors. They launched a survey asking specifically what barriers are women facing. Some of the topics included gaps in mentorship and adequate supports for families, and the survey was inspired by a national report stating that women experience barriers in leadership roles in agriculture. And from my own experience, Mr. Speaker, I can say that this rings true for Nova Scotia. What concrete action has the minister and this government taken to encourage more women to become involved in fisheries, aquaculture, and agriculture?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries, Agriculture and Agriculture.
Well, I can tell the member opposite all the senior management in the Department of Agriculture are women. All of them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. The terms of reference state that the short list will normally contain not fewer than 3 candidates. Normally not contain. It doesn't require a minimum of 3. Therefore, a list of 1 is a complete list under the terms of reference. Does the minister acknowledge that he was presented a complete list of 1 recommended candidate, and any effort to expand that list is interference?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's my colleague's interpretation of the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker. The short list will normally contain no fewer than 3. We know there were 2 applicants, Mr. Speaker. One of them was the incumbent. Common sense and sound judgment, Mr. Speaker, in the absence of any information that questions the leadership of the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court, in my mind, as the minister, delegated that authority under the Act, Mr. Speaker, the responsibility to ensure that it is an informed process, Mr. Speaker, only reasonable that I ask for the precipice and resume of the sitting incumbent Chief Judge of the Provincial Court.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the committee would have considered all of the information before it. They would have looked at the candidates. They would have analyzed the precepts of all the candidates, and they made a recommendation. I'm not weighing in here. I'm weighing in on what the committee has said. And what we do know is that after that process, the Chief Justice of this province resigned, saying that he felt undermined by that minister's actions. The minister forced the production of a resume from the committee and refused to accept the experience and expertise of the committee members by not accepting their recommendation. Why does the minister deny that this is interference in the process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the legislation clearly lays out, the policies and procedures, including the terms of reference, the work of the committee is one element of the selection process, Mr. Speaker. It's an important element of the selection process. It is advice and recommendation to the minister. The minister gathers all of the facts, makes an informed decision, and makes a recommendation to Executive Council, Mr. Speaker. I will not exclude, and no one in a reasonable state of mind using common sense and sound judgment would exclude the incumbent, the proven strong leader of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'll remind the House again that it's International Women's Day. My question is for the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board. In 2017, Nova Scotia had the highest percentage of women in the low-income category of all provinces in Canada. As of 2017, 20,000 more women are in low income compared to 2013. Our numbers have shot up, while many other provinces are improving. Will the minister acknowledge that her government's fiscal policies are driving women's wages down?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member, and congratulations on having an opportunity to stand and ask a question today. I do want to acknowledge that we use a gender lens when we are looking at all of our policies, all of our practices, all of the programs. That gender lens goes beyond gender, but it looks at equalization and making sure that we provide equal opportunity for all Nova Scotians. And so every one of us, I think it's been stated here in the House, every one of us wants to see that representation of females rising, increasing, and we have looked at and do provide supports in our programs where there are incentives for businesses and for government to hire people, to hire women in our force.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer, although respectfully I'm not sure that gender lens is working. Mr. Speaker, during the NDP mandate, the median income for women increased by $4,000. Since the Liberals came to power, it has fallen by $500, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, we know that jobs that have been traditionally considered women's work are underpaid and that women are overrepresented in low-wage sectors. One powerful way to raise wages for these women would be to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The majority of workers who would benefit from that are women. But so far, that's a policy this government refuses to support. And I'd like to take this opportunity on International Women's Day to invite the minister. Will she support giving over 70,000 Nova Scotian women a raise by increasing the minimum wage meaningfully to $15 an hour?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member raises the question of minimum wage. That's been raised here in the House before. It's conversations that I've had as a minister and previous ministers have had, in particular with the impact that minimum wage would have not only on the women who may be in the workforce, but on the employers who will be looking at the cost to them to raise that minimum wage. And so that's a conversation that has been had. It's a conversation that will continue, and I would be pleased to take the comments from the member to that group of small business.
The Honourable Member for Quaharbor Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today on International Women's Day, I am sad to report that 39% of all Canadian adult women have reported at least one sexual assault since the age of 16, and it's most often by someone that they know. I'm sure everyone remembers the tragic story last fall of the young woman in Truro who was a victim of a sexual assault, went to her local hospital for treatment, and was turned away. I was so happy when my colleagues from both sides of the party on this side of the House championed the issue, and the minister committed to bringing the same program to Truro, and I'll table that document. It gave me a sense of relief to know that this crucial service would finally be coming to Truro. My question for the Minister of Health is, when will the request for proposal for the provision of the same program and service make it to market? Thank you.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising the question. First, I want to assure you, Mr. Speaker, and all members that services are available in emergency departments for victims of sexual assault, and I encourage people to take advantage of that if necessary. With respect to saying services, Mr. Speaker, these enhanced services are available in some parts of the province, and we've been expanding those services. With respect to Truro, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the department worked with local providers that had previously submitted an application or a proposal. Those efforts to fast track and get that proposal implemented fell through, so it had to move to an RFP, Mr. Speaker. It's my understanding, I believe the Nova Scotia Health Authority has recently provided that just within the last few days to the department. Move to procurement.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.